Professor David Stuart, you are a bit of a living legend. Archaeologist,
Is that true?
epigrapher. I think it is. According to your bio on the internet, you are a child prodigy. You gave your first scholarly paper at the age of 12, so I'm told. And you've contributed vastly to our understanding of the Maya writing system in the, decades since. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me here.
Excellent. I gather you've just got back from Guatemala.
I did. I was down in Guatemala for about a week. I was traipsing around in various archaeological sites, Tikal especially, which is one of my favorite places to go.
Oh, I
And
love Tikal. Love Tikal.
yeah, just majestic place in
Mm.
the middle of the jungle. And so yeah, I was visiting with colleagues and showing some friends around some of these sites. And yeah, I love to get down there at least, a couple of times a year if I can.
It really is an incredible part of the world. It really is. There's just something about that place. There really is. So that was a pleasure trip rather than a business trip.
Well, a bit of both, a bit of both.
Bit of both.
Yeah, one of my colleagues, a former student of mine, is directing the excavations these days at Tikal. And so he accompanied me there, and we walked around for about a day, looking at things that he was up to, that he had done last year, and then he was planning for the coming year. So it's always fun to see Tikal with people who are, hands-on, who are working there, really finding new things. And so I was also very proud that my former student was doing this, and then this amazing role. I was kind of envious of him in a way.
That is amazing. It's a truly vast site. Is it the biggest Maya city?
It's one of the biggest. I mean, we've always wondered how to measure the scale of Maya cities in a way, right? And we map them and we survey them, and then LIDAR comes around and it looks like it's much bigger than we thought. And how do you define where one city ends and another begins? Because the Maya world was so densely populated at times that there's settlement everywhere in the countryside. So yeah, it's huge. It's a massive place. Population guesstimates for a place like Tikal in say 700-800 AD would be 80,000, something like that. And those are very rough figures, but a lot of people living right there. And there are sites that are just as big, if not bigger. Caracol, Calakmul, right?
Yeah. And then Calakmul, I mean, we know much more now than we did, but for a vast amount of time we knew nothing about it.
That's true. Calakmul has been late to the game in our understanding of Maya archaeology and Maya history. I mean, it was a very remote site until really the 1980s, and even then it was really hard to get to. And it's opened up recently, just with a road that one can access. Ecotourism, adventure tourism trips go there, but still, relatively untouched by archaeologists. Just some of the core of the city has been intensely excavated, but there's a lot we still don't know about Calakmul and many other Maya cities.
I think I read somewhere that a lot of the sort of glyphs and the writing has been eroded away at Calakmul. Is that right?
Yeah,
Can we read things that have happened there?
Calakmul is famous, maybe a bit notorious, for having more carved monuments than any other Maya city. And about 90 years ago, when it was first being explored by Sylvanus Morley and other famous early Maya archaeologists, there was all this excitement. This new site has all of these carved monuments. The problem was the limestone that they were using at Calakmul was so shoddy and so porous that it just eroded like crazy, and very few of the inscriptions there are really too legible. So, but with the excavations, a lot of new things have been found, and that's really helped.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah.
I mean, since the 1980s, according to the internet, you have been at the forefront of, reading some of these things that have been discovered. I'm interested to find out sort of the state of knowledge in the 1970s versus now. Like, what is the additional things that we've learned since these great leaps forward in understanding the Maya writing systems?
Well, the 1970s is a good place to begin. Uh, that was when I first encountered Maya culture, Maya hieroglyphs, Maya archaeology. My father was an archaeologist, and this is why I got a fairly early start with all of this, right? Because I was, you know, on his projects. I was living in archaeological sites for a time. And I would ask my dad in sites, we would walk by a monument with hieroglyphs on it. And I would say, well, Dad, what is this? What does this say? I didn't know anything then. And he would say, well, no one can really read this stuff yet, right? And that just intrigued me. I remember just almost becoming obsessed, and I guess I did eventually, right, with this question of these mysterious glyphs. And in the 1970s, a few things were possible. People could read dates, the calendar. The ancient Maya calendar had been deciphered many decades earlier. That was pretty much it, though. I mean, there were maybe some personal names that could be teased out, of this king and that king. Maybe some sequences of name glyphs without reading the names. Maybe a couple of historical events like, oh, this is a war record, and this is maybe a crowning of a king, that kind of thing. Just sort of a functional interpretation of the texts. What was missing was language, right? What was missing was a literal understanding of what they were writing. And so what really happened in the 1980s, especially looking back on it, was this huge pivot, a series of breakthroughs that allowed us to understand how the script was working, how to connect the writing system in a really methodical way to the language that was being written in the system. And by the 90s, and again, in retrospect, it seemed to happen kind of slowly, but it was actually quite quick. Within 15, 20 years, we had gone from, not really knowing a lot to knowing a whole lot. So, by the late 1990s, 2000s, we could read ancient Maya texts really well, and we could read them in their original language, which was just kind of a stunning thing to realize. In the 70s, I don't think we really even had that expectation.
It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. It really is. And I mean, how did you do it?
Well,
it wasn't just you, but how did
it wasn't just me?
How was it done?
So a few things kind of converged at this time. I think one of the main reasons it happened when it did in the 80s was communication among the few of us who were working on this stuff, and this was before email, right? So it was hard sometimes to communicate, but we were a small group. A lot of us knew each other. We were friends. You had kind of this cohort of people, and a lot of us were sort of, oddballs. We were coming at it. I was coming at it as a teenager, right? But people were taking me seriously, which was kind of nice. There were also, my mentor at the time was a studio artist who just happened to just love Maya art, and she was seeing all sorts of things. Linda Schele, and I had
a great scholar,
yeah,
Linda
yeah,
Schele.
and other kind of up and coming young Turks, as we were called by some people in that era, who were just ready to kind of blow things up and really move forward. And so the thing that happened was, we had some teamwork, we had communication, we had a new archives that were coming out, and new inscriptions. We had photocopiers, right, which maybe didn't exist in the 50s or 60s as common as they were then. So I was putting together binders and binders and binders of drawings of Maya inscriptions, and doing my own drawings, and it was a convergence of things like that. The data was better, right? The sample of hieroglyphs and inscriptions was a lot better than it had been.
So it's a sheer quantity sort of data rather than a
think
Rosetta
that was a
Stone
big driver. Yeah, that
sort
was a
of.
big
Yeah,
driver,
yeah,
and I think there were some established Maya archaeologists who for decades had dominated the field. I'm thinking here especially of Sir Eric Thompson, who in the 40s, 50s, 60s really dominated Maya scholarship, and he had some very fossilized ideas about how Maya hieroglyphs work, and no one was really successful or even willing to really question his authority. I think he passed away right after he was knighted in 1975, and I think that was also kind of a pivotal year, right? It kind of opened things up a bit for the
yeah.
field, and that's exactly when people just started going whole hog into the stuff and and um, and teasing out these patterns. We had conferences multiple times a year sometimes, and yeah, it was just a lot of synergy.
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
really reached a crescendo, I think, in the mid 80s, at least from my perspective.
There is that saying of science moves forward one funeral at a time. Bit of a grim saying, but it's
I
kind
mean,
of true.
Thompson
It's
was
kind of
great.
true.
I guess he gets dissed sometimes, and he was a very stubborn scholar, but he was also a
Yeah,
brilliant guy,
of
which is why
course,
he
of
was
course,
so
of course.
important.
But I mean, he began 1930s, was it 1920s?
1919, well, I guess he began in the 1920s, but the 30s.
Yeah, I mean that's
Uh,
a long, long time ago. So from then to the 1970s, a
yeah.
lot had changed. Yeah, so I mean, it makes sense that he was still a bit old-fashioned, but yeah, Can we write histories now of dynasties and political events between kingdoms, or is it still a little bit interpretive? Are we still being a bit creative when we're doing that?
Well, we can read almost everything that the Maya wrote about their dynasties and their royal histories. Uh, at the same time, we do have to read between the lines
Of course.
and interpret from what we've got. I mean, we're incredibly lucky, obviously, to have what we have of Maya history. The names and the dates and the ruler sequences. We can reconstruct, two or three dozen dynastic lines or from different city states from the classic period. Now, the hard part, in a way, is figuring out the relations between them, figuring out some of the backstories of these histories. They're not telling us, like Thucydides or something, right? They're not telling us the machinations of kings who decide to go to war. We have to, when we can, reconstruct some of that, and I think we can, see some motives for history, things that go behind historical events. But it's tough. I mean, when they write history, they write the date, which is very nice to have. They write, okay, so and so's army collapsed or something like that. It's a record of a defeat, and such a king was victorious, and so and so was captured. Or they might talk about the crowning of a king and how the gods were witnessing it or something like that. They're very terse, they're very matter of fact sometimes about the history that they're writing, so we have to go in and um, weave together more of a narrative sometimes that we would like to see.
It's a bit propagandistic, isn't it? It's a bit like
Of
the
course,
pharaonic
yeah.
accounts of Egypt. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it maybe is a bit different in terms of its language and some of the kinds of information it's conveying. But of course, yeah, these are the official royal documents set in stone that were recording their rituals and really describing the role of kings and queens and elites in this cosmic political order, right? So they had their important functions as ceremonial performers and as war leaders, and to kind of maintain everything. So yes, it is propagandistic in that sense.
What are the main sites that we could reconstruct the history of? I mean, are there a group that have the most inscriptions?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the landscape of of Maya cities in let's say the classic period, which is, roughly about 200 to 900. There's some sites we know more about than others. I would say the really detailed histories that we have are from Tikal, from Palenque, from Copan in Honduras, Calakmul in Mexico, uh, Naranjo in Guatemala. I could go on. I mean, there are probably, I don't know, a dozen, 15 kingdoms we know really, really well. Something like that. I've never really counted them. And then we have a bunch of other sites where we have, fragmented records, and we know a king here, a king there. Putting it all together is a bit more difficult. And all it takes is one inscription to come out of the ground somewhere, which happens pretty regularly now, for a lot of gaps to be filled, for new connections to be made.
It's endlessly fascinating. It's endlessly fascinating. There's so much of it. It's it's a bit overwhelming. There's so many of them. There's so many of them. What's your favorite? Do you have a favorite city?
Well, I'll preface this by saying I'm glad you said it's overwhelming, because I feel it's overwhelming too. I
And
feel
you've dedicated your life to it.
right, and there are a good many of us now who specialize in all of this material, and I think we all kind of feel because I mean I also was active in the 80s and 90s and so forth and all of this. I'm still writing up research from that era, right? Because it's like a fire hose of history coming at us, and processing it is not
It
always
really
quick.
is. Yeah.
So, in terms of my favorite, I mean, I've had my own, wonderful experiences in the field, uh, working directly with the archaeology and the sites and the inscriptions. One of the places when I was in my 20s where I was really, uh, getting my chops as an archaeologist and integrating history and archaeology was Copan, in Honduras. Just a beautiful site. It's not the biggest Maya city, but it's up in the mountains, and the sculpture there is just extraordinary. And
It's funny you
lots
should
and
mention that. That was the
yeah,
first Maya city I visited. Actually,
really.
I did a volunteering thing 10 years ago, and in Honduras, and I visited there.
Wow,
So yeah,
wow. Well, I mean, you
it,
know what
it
I mean.
affect,
Then it's just
yeah.
gorgeous.
Oh yeah, it affected me too.
Yeah, yeah. So we were in the 80s, reading the inscriptions in new ways. We were integrating it with the archaeology, because before then, before I would say the mid 80s, Maya archaeology and Maya epigraphy, the study of glyphs, they really had this separate existence, and they weren't really integrated.
Mm,
You know,
yeah.
and there were a lot of archaeologists who, in that era, were kind of skeptical of what the glyphs had to say, or whether they were even relevant for looking at the rise and fall of the Maya, and big questions. Some kind of dismissive attitudes. Oh, it's all propaganda. Why should we even be bothering with this stuff? This is, but it's written history, right? And so we could read the names of these rulers. We could tell, I remember actually working closely with a number of archaeologists at Copan, and realizing this king built this pyramid over here, and this other king, his son, built that pyramid over there. We could ascribe people to these monuments, and that was just an eye opener for everybody, right? So now my archaeology is very historically informed, at
Absolutely.
Copan
There's
and
that
at many of
great
these sites.
there's that great artifact sculpture where it's got all of the kings of Copan going around it.
That's right. Yeah, this is a wonderful sculpture. It's known as Altar Q,
That's it.
and it's this cube-like or box-like stone that has 16 seated people around the
Mm.
perimeter, four on each side. And yeah, this is the king list, the visual king list of the dynasty. And we can read many of their names, and the message of this monument is really fantastic, because it's dedicated by one of the last rulers we know from Copan, and he's shown on one of the faces of it, receiving the the staff of office from the first king in the sequence. And so number 1 and number 16 meet up on one side, and it's just
It's
kind of a
quite
great
convenient. It's quite
right.
convenient. It's
Yeah,
good.
it is. Of course, that's a political message. That's propaganda right there. But it's this very, I don't know, very elegant way of representing history is coming full circle.
Yeah, yeah, and it shows, they had this idea of their own history as well, which I find endlessly fascinating as well. They were aware of all the previous rulers that had gone before.
Not only aware of it, I think they were almost obsessed with this idea of establishing their own legacy and their pedigree, right? Not unlike a lot of kings out there in ancient history, always wanting to talk about ancestors and making sure that these connections are well established between the founders of a dynasty and the current ruler, following in the footsteps of these great heroic figures. That's the underlying message of a lot of the history we see.
Absolutely, absolutely. Do we ever get conflicting accounts between cities where one city says something completely different to another city?
This is a really interesting question. Um, there aren't any examples of outright contradictions that I can think of. One thing that we do get are historical events that may be couched or described in different ways. Um, one has to do with a war that happened between Copan and its neighbor Quirigua. Quirigua was sort of an upstart client kingdom that in the 8th century really turned the tables on Copan and um, revolted essentially. And its king captured the Copan ruler and decapitated him. And we have a
Yeah,
record of this at Quirigua. And he boasts about this, over and over and over again. You go to Copan, and of course they don't record that, right? They do record the
yeah,
war. They record exactly the same day, and there's this kind of a lament in one inscription that talks about, there were uh, no buildings, no altars, no, they're lamenting the kind of lack of construction of ritual spaces and, sort of the downtimes of Copan. They don't talk about the sacrifice and decapitation of their king. I think they mentioned that he died, but it's very, kind of, matter of fact or something like that, right? So we do get these different kinds of descriptions of history, but I think the underlying point here is an important one. You know, we may find contradictions sometime. I wouldn't be surprised, but the consistency of history across the board between all of these different city states and rivals is really extraordinary. When they do talk about one another and they do, they're very aware of each other, right, and write about each other. It's very, very consistent, and it just goes to show how tightly wound up these places were together in kind of with common threads of history and family connections and everything.
Do you think it was important that they got it right because the gods were watching?
Yeah, I think it would have been hard to write alternative histories. You know what I mean? Um, because of these connections, family connections, being very aware of each other's goings on. Yeah, I think it would have been tough for them just to make things up. We used to have these debates actually in the 70s and 80s, especially. There was a king of a Maya kingdom, the site of Palenque. Uh, and this is a fascinating case study because the archaeology done in the 1950s exposed the tomb of this great ruler, this
This is
famous tomb
Pakal.
from Palenque. Right, we know his name to be Pakal today. His name wasn't deciphered until the 70s,
Ah,
fully until maybe the late 80s. We could finally read his full name. The inscription said that he was 80 years old when he died, but the archaeologists in the 1950s had established his age at death to be maybe in his 50s. And so, this was held up as this, great case study of a conflict between archaeology and history, right?
Mm.
You know, this must be evidence that the inscriptions of Palenque were exaggerating the age of Pakal. That how can science be wrong, right? It turns out that the physical anthropology and the analysis of the bones done in the 1950s had only said that he was at a minimum in his 50s. And these bones were reanalyzed, and they were determined to be completely consistent with an 80-year-old who's lived a good life, who didn't have all the stresses on his bones that you
Yeah.
might see
Yeah.
otherwise. And so what seemed like a big conflict in our data and interpretations, and a dismissing of written history by some in archaeology, turns out it actually works out fine. So it always was a question with me, like, how would the Maya be able to exaggerate the age of a king? When people know this person and they know, they're writing during his lifetime, how can they say he's
Yes.
30 or 40 years older
Absolutely.
than he actually is? So I think there's a certain control built into the data we have, where they're not exaggerating like that. They're not necessarily, quote unquote, lying to us. There's a lot of propaganda there, but sure, as long as we acknowledge that, we can read the history and we can see that it's pretty consistent internally.
Yeah. They might, mess up the details a little bit of a battle, but
Sure,
they're not going to lie
sure.
about the battle itself.
Hmm.
Pakal, didn't he come to the throne at the age of 12 or something like that?
Yeah, he
Young
was a
boy.
young king, 12 years old, and lived until he was 80. He
It's a
was
long time. Long time.
that's one of the longest historical reigns that we know of from history. And there's another
Ever. Yeah.
Maya king who may be just about as long. And yeah, there are very few regions and or kings in history that live that long or reign that long globally. And so when we look at a place like Palenque, Pakal, his stamp is all over that city. They celebrate him as this great heroic figure, and his sons and grandsons and great grandsons just constantly talk about him. So, when we're talking about royal ancestors and how important they are, he's a great example.
Who's the other one? You said there's another Maya ruler who was long
Well,
lived.
yeah, there's a ruler who I talk about in my book, whose name is Ah-Num-Sah, and he was a ruler of a kingdom at a site we called Naranjo. And he also reigned for a very, very, very long time, around the time of Pakal, and they were contemporaries. I bet they did know each other because they were, around at the same time. And again, these were tight knit, dynastic cultures, who were interrelated and intermarried and at
Mm,
times. And so,
yeah.
yeah, he was the other one. There were a lot of kings and rulers who were established early on as kids, placed on the throne probably by overarching political powers, in these client states, and then once they mature, they become powerful rulers in their own right.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? The extent to which he was actually ruling at 12 years old is interesting. He's got to have some shadowy figures behind the scenes pulling the strings, surely.
No doubt. And, we don't have a lot of history, if any, really, from that era of him being a boy king. He was installed on the throne of Palenque right in the wake of Palenque being conquered and overthrown by a much more powerful kingdom to the east called the Canuls, based at Calakmul and based in another site called Tibanche. They were, spreading their influence throughout the Maya region. Palenque was defeated. Pakal was installed, perhaps even as a client of the Canuls originally. We're not quite sure. But his mother, Pakal's mother, is often shown with him. She really was the power behind his rule while
Of
he
course.
was a youngster. And once she passes away, you see all this activity happening at Palenque, with Pakal finally, I think, getting some freedom to be a king in his 40s, in his 50s, in his 60s, right? So
Yes.
His story
Finally
is a
free.
fascinating one. Right, finally free of his overbearing mother.
Was his mother from the canal? The canals, are they the Snake Kingdom?
The Snake Kingdom is the Kanul Kingdom, yes.
Yeah.
Uh,
Was she one? Was she a snake?
well, that is a possibility. She's not identified as such, but the timing of her uh, appearance on the scene and Pakal's crowning, uh, that seems to conform to a pattern we see elsewhere, where the Kanul kingdom was very often using the princesses, the female nobility of its own family to marry off and to uh, create these connections with these client kingdoms. And we see this more clearly elsewhere, but Palenque fits that pattern. It may well be that Pakal was initially part of that, within the Kanul or Snake Kingdom fold, but later on we know there's actually a war where he is certainly not taking part in that any longer.
So he fights back against Kalak Mul, does he? And I know that there's big dynastic alliances and things going on.
Yes, yes. He actually wages a series of wars against his enemies directly to the east of Palenque. We can document all of this very clearly. And those enemies were allies of the Kanuls.
Interesting.
And the complicated thing here is that these alliances are shifting all the time. We do have to be careful because it would be very easy to say, oh, Palenque is an enemy of the Kanuls. Well, that may be true for one particular reign, but if Maya history has anything to tell us, it's that these kinds of relationships and these alliances could so easily shift around and break apart and realign. So this was a challenge I had in trying to craft a kind of a holistic narrative of this era, is that just to baldly state that such and such a site was the friend or the enemy of this site, yeah, well, maybe for a small period of time, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it's amazing how this stuff was always shifting around.
Absolutely. It's like medieval Europe, these dynasties interweaving with each
Yeah,
other.
yeah,
It's fascinating.
absolutely. I mean, the more that we know about the Maya, the more it kind of conforms to some of these other ideas we have of histories. I think medieval Europe is a pretty good analogy. Maybe some of the Greek city-states is another good analogy,
Yeah, yeah.
where they have this common kind of Greekness, but with these different subcultures and political structures, and yet all kind of connected and related to each other as well.
Of course. How much can we say that there was intermarriage going on between cities? I mean, is that the sort of thing that's recorded? Do we have such and such is a queen at, I don't know,
Absolutely.
Tikal, but we know that she's from somewhere else?
Exactly. They're
Yeah.
very precise about documenting these connections. They were very important. And so, for example, in Palenque, the royal wives were the ones we can name and identify, often have these foreign affiliations. This was pretty standard, right? So where we do see this documented especially is with these daughters of the kings of the Kanuls of the Snake Kingdom. They appear as powerful figures in all of these different places outside of Calakmul, where they marry the local ruler, but they will have the political authority. And so they may have whole monuments dedicated just to them, where you see these incredibly powerful women with, ritual regalia and standing on war prisoners. And, you know, again, a lot of this sort of visual language of power is ascribed sometimes even more to the women than to the men. One of the Kanul uh, women who was so influential was, we call her Lady Six Sky as a nickname. She had a Mayan name, which was a little longer. And she was married into Naranjo, into this other kingdom. Uh, we know almost nothing about her husband. He's such a secondary, tertiary guy in this narrative. Everything focuses on her. And then she has a son who can claim all this descent from these great foreign kings. and he becomes a major political and military operator in his own right. So so this is what I mean by these through lines that you can track, right, among these different kingdoms.
It's super interesting. I mean, you get very powerful queens. I mean, are they queens in their own right, or are they? Do they have a
Yeah,
what would their
yeah,
title be?
no,
Yeah, they are. They are
no,
known as
they're called
queens.
they're called
Yeah.
Isha Hao, which is essentially a noblewoman or a queen, and they are again, very often the primary political power on the throne. Um, and this was a very patrilineal world, at least conceptually,
Mm,
right, in terms of descent.
absolutely.
But the
Yeah.
women, these
Yeah.
women are the symbols and the real glue behind these regional networks of alliance that are being formed. And this is, of course, what happens globally, right? The Aztecs did this in their history. And again, like you say, it's like medieval Europe, where you have,
Of
the
course.
royal women establishing these
Oh yeah.
larger,
Oh yeah.
larger
Oh yeah.
networks.
That's right. Yeah, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you are of the right lineage and you are the right social class.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I suppose it's important to mention that this is all the elites. This is all the elite history. I mean, did the Maya really see the elites as almost like a different species? Is that an exaggeration?
It's hard to say. We're lacking the perspective of the everyday Maya when we're looking at these written histories, right? We have a hard time, or at least I do, sensing how they were viewed socially uh, by the general population. Um, was there a disconnect between elites and non-elites? Uh, Probably, in some ways. I think these two worlds may have contributed ultimately to the collapse of classic Maya society, which maybe we can talk about. But at the same time, these were communities living in close proximity to one another. Most Maya elites weren't living in the mega cities. They weren't living at Calakmul or Tikal. They were living, rather close to everyone else, but in very nice houses with nice plazas and temples around them. Our sense of ancient Maya social structure is very, very simplistic, perhaps. I think there were gradations of status. There were middle class folks and specialists who were tied into the royal courts, perhaps, maybe even literate and being able to read and write. Who knows? We've lost so much of that kind of nuance in both the archaeology and in the written history. We don't necessarily see it either.
But it's sad how much we've lost, isn't it? It's sad how much we've lost. What can we say about the Star Wars? I mean, it's a nice title, isn't it? The wars between Tikal and Calakmul. I think they're the most famous wars of the Maya.
Yeah, and for listeners, Star Wars. There is a connection between Star Wars the
There
movie
is
and the Maya
there is a
world.
connection.
That's not what
Yeah.
you're talking about. The
That's
very
not what I'm talking
first
about.
the very first movie, A New Hope as it's called these days, although I saw it as a kid as Star Wars,
I think it's still
has
the best one.
Tikal. They filmed it in Tikal, the
It's the
Rebel
Rebel
Moon base.
base.
That's
Yeah,
right. Anyway, that's not what you were asking about.
that's not what I'm
It,
talking
but
about.
but coincidentally, in the 70s and 80s, um, we were looking at Maya warfare, uh, and records of Maya warfare, and there was a glyph that we knew referred to war and conflict, and it happened to have a star sign in the grouping of elements, and so, of course, being the time it was, people called this the Star War glyph or Star Wars. And so there's a bit of literature in the 80s and 90s that talk about Maya Star Wars. Really a little confusing for people. Has nothing really to do with the movie directly, but indirectly, yes. So yes, when there are these conflicts, right, that talk about these great rivalries, and the two big players in or you might say superpowers of classic Maya history, were Tikal, and their dynasty was called the Mutuls. Tikal is a modern name, but Mutul was the place and the dynasty. Their rivals were the Snake Kingdom, the Kanuls we talked about, and they're based not that far away to the north at Calakmul, and a bit earlier at a huge site called Tsibanche. The Mutuls and the Kanuls, they're the great rivalry that really determines the political history and the geopolitics of the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries. And it's remarkable to see how these alliances are all formed again and how they kind of contract and expand and shift. But that's the overarching backdrop, you might say, for Maya history, is this conflict. And yeah, we have records of Tikal being attacked. We have records of the Kanul kingdoms losing. 695, there's a big war where Tikal defeats the Kanul ruler. And the most famous temple at Tikal, by the way, this skyscraper-like pyramid, Temple 1, was a commemorative monument about that victory, recorded in the upper shrine. It was a big, big deal. They captured the sacred image of the Kanul army and paraded it around as like a captive, and maybe even housed it in that temple. So, this is how we now frame Maya history. Is much of it, at least, is through this conflict.
When they destroyed, when they defeated Calakmul, they didn't destroy the city.
Not as far as we know. What we're probably seeing here is a record of a military defeat, maybe not in the city center of Calakmul, but probably in between somewhere on the landscape. They don't specify usually where these battles are taking place, but we do have records of outright conquests where they seem to be even burning temples and penetrating into the downtown areas of sites.
Was that unusual, or do you think that was pretty normal for Maya warfare?
It's interesting you asked that, because it seems to be unusual up to a point, and then in the later decades of Maya history, it becomes much more common. These records of violent destruction seem to really peak in the late 700s, and not coincidentally, fall or the collapse of many of these kingdoms takes place in the early 800s, right? I see that warfare was always part of the Maya world, but the way they describe it does change a bit, and they talk about the burning and the fleeing. They actually talk about people running away from one site and going to another, right? A king is being chased around by his enemy, and he goes to this place and then he goes to that place. There's some kind of amusing narratives of one poor king in particular who's just on the run, right? And he's being chased around the Maya world. These were very personal
Yes.
wars in some extent,
yes.
right?
Of course.
They warfare was it happened at many different scales, many different ways. But yeah, as time goes on, the later decades of history, you get a sense of a lot more violence, a lot more destruction.
It seems like things get a bit more serious, but before warfare there'd almost been a bit of a pageantry to it, a bit of it being, I don't know, a set battle in a certain place at a certain time. Later on, it becomes a bit more chaotic, killing everybody.
Perhaps. I think our interpretations have changed, of course, but
of course,
there is this thinking that Maya warfare was kind of a performative thing, sometimes, and it probably was, kind of captivating and not really that destructive. I think it was a fairly constant stress point for Maya culture throughout the recorded history we can read. Conflict was always there, potentially, but it does seem to change in terms of its, I don't know, maybe the numbers of battles, the numbers of conflicts, the intensity of it does seem to get much worse, in the late 8th century, leading up to the collapse.
It's interesting that once upon a time the Maya were seen as quite peaceful philosopher kings who didn't really do warfare.
No, I mean it's bizarre, isn't it? If you go back in time and look at what people were writing in the 30s and 40s,
Yeah.
um, that's
Sylvanus
really
Morley, you mentioned. He was
Sylvanus
the
Morley,
Philosopher
Eric
King's guy.
Thompson also.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
they weren't alone in describing the Maya as being this kind of peaceful civilization. And nowadays we kind of scratch our heads and we wonder, where did that interpretation come from back then? What were they? What were they thinking? What were they smoking? Coming up with these interpretations. But it was part of the intellectual culture of the time. I think it's been said that this was, in a way, kind of a reaction to World War One, and even World War Two. This kind of Europe and the United States going through this trauma, and this was maybe kind of a reaction to that, kind of embracing the Maya as being more, different from everybody else. Of course, that's unrealistic. What kind of stuns me sometimes is to read these interpretations of the Maya as peaceful, yet those scholars of that era, they could see in the art that there were warriors holding big spears and shields with captives. I mean, why couldn't they see that and interpret it? And of course, now we have the written history. And the written history is focused really on alliance and conflict and reformulation of alliance and new conflict. It's just this back and forth all the time in the
There's
history.
a demystification of it, really, because it's just, we realise that they're just like everybody else throughout human history.
Well,
We're
there
all
you
similar.
go. I mean, the
Yeah.
Maya have had this strange role in the popular imagination, really since, for 100 years. Not only being kind of this strangely peaceful, idyllic civilization, but, stargazing and not of this world, sort of, detached
Yeah.
in some way.
Yeah. A bit weird and
And, and,
different.
and,
Yeah.
and we're still dealing with that, right? We still have
Mm.
these narratives about the Maya and their connection to aliens and whatever.
Ancient aliens and yeah.
Yeah, and that a lot of people who visit Chichen Itza or who visit Maya cities, you know, I've seen tourists ask about aliens, and they're like, they're just not there. Sorry.
Yeah.
The thing is that we're in the popular imagination, we have this disconnect. The scholarly world now has known for a few decades that no, the Maya are like everyone else. They're very human. They have conflict. They have fantastic art. They're very humanistic. And this is what really has to change in the popular imagination, is the recognition that, they're like the Egyptians. They're like
Of
the
course.
ancient Greeks. They're like the, China, you name it, where we have written history. These are very human stories, and the Maya are no different.
Yeah, and there's a lot of similarities between places. You go back to the very earliest days of China with the Liangshu culture. I don't know if you've ever seen that. It looks a bit like the ancient Maya. They've got pyramids, they've got sacrifices, they've got all this pageantry and all these massive,
I know. I mean, the
urban
stuff in
centres.
Neolithic China in the Shang
Mm.
Dynasty. I mean, I studied quite a bit of that stuff when I was in college, probably because it looked vaguely Maya, some of the
It
aesthetics,
does.
and
It does.
and
Yeah.
and some of these
Yeah.
new. I mean, this fantastic site in Neolithic China, Shimao, right? This fortress with these carved walls, that have very Mesoamerican looking
It's
designs
amazing.
on them. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, much
It's
earlier than
absolutely
anything in
amazing.
Mesoamerica, but
That's right.
yeah,
That's right.
it
Yeah.
has that kind of look that's
But
very
these same kind of patterns pop up all over the place, and
absolutely they
I
do.
mean,
Sure.
everybody likes to build a pyramid. I just before we go, because we're going to talk, we're going towards the collapse, we're going towards the classic collapse, but just before we get there, I want to go back in time and just ask you about the pre-classic very briefly. Do we have any writing at all in the pre-classic?
We do have some writing in the pre-classic. The problem we've
Interesting.
got, though, is that they don't write long inscriptions on stone monuments. And where they do write a little bit on stone monuments, pretty much it's eroded or damaged. A lot of pre-classic sculpture was kind of broken up by the Maya and repurposed and found in construction fill and that kind of thing. So, we're at a disadvantage there. We know they had writing because we find more often painted examples. So painted walls of shrines, most famous example being San Bartolo, where I worked and have worked for a number of years, has some of the earliest Maya hieroglyphs that we know anywhere. Beautiful, fully developed. I mean, clearly with centuries and centuries of development behind it. So they're painting on in books, they're painting on textiles, perishable media. Uh, so there was this literate culture of the pre-classic. Frustratingly, we can't really access it that well. We can't read those texts very well. They're mostly captions, name captions for these mythical figures at San Bartolo. Not so much narrative texts or histories. So yeah, pre-classic culture looks different in many ways than the classic period.
We don't know of any kings and queens. Is that fair to say?
Well, we do a little bit because
the
later classic inscriptions from time to time will harken back and they'll mention some great ancestor. And sometimes they'll do so with great specificity about when this person ruled. It could be in the 5th century BC or something like that, 800 years earlier than when they're writing this down. And these are really intriguing. They're one-offs, right? We can't necessarily link these remote figures to archaeology, let's say. It would be shocking if we ever could really do that. But I tend to take them at face value. They're intriguing because they seem so specific, almost too specific to not be true. We also know that they mythologize these ancestors, and some of these heroic figures go back thousands and thousands of years, way too early to really be real. But if they're hearkening back to, say, 400 BC, 300 BC, 200 BC, that's in the realm of I think, memorable history, and they probably had these records, right? So they did have kings, they had rulers, they had important figures. What's different is that the classic period, starting around 100 AD or 200 AD, this is where you see the crystallization of a lot of these dynasties that start off. They're starting anew. Where they're coming from, we're not sure, but there was some other earlier political order in the pre-classic, clearly, that we really don't know much about. So there's a kind of a dynastic, pre-dynastic setup, a bit like ancient Egypt, maybe.
How interesting. And in the 4th century AD, something happens because Teotihuacan, which is the biggest city the New World had ever seen.
Pretty much the biggest city, in Mesoamerica for sure. And
it's the Rome of the New World.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty apt parallel. Massive city on the outskirts of today of Mexico City. Teotihuacan was a very mysterious place still, I have to say. It's vast. It doesn't look much like any Maya site that I know well. It's laid out on a grid, very regimented, just massive scale pyramids and streets and so forth. And not surprisingly, they have a role to play in the larger Mesoamerican story along with the Maya, right? So the history, this is really intriguing. There's a pivotal event that happens in the year 378. It's one of the earliest real historical episodes we know about for the Maya. And the local king of Tikal was, according to several texts, defeated and died upon the arrival of a powerful military figure who's coming from the highlands of Mexico, coming from Teotihuacan. And all of a sudden we see at Tikal and its surrounding centers kind of a new political order that's lasting for 50, 60 years, something like that, where Teotihuacan really does seem to be calling the shots over several powerful Maya kingdoms.
Copan too, as well.
Well, eventually in Copan, the dynasty there is kind of reset, and there's a new founder figure who is ruler number 1 of the 16 of Copan, who's mentioned on that altar queue I mentioned before, right? He's depicted there. Yeah. So Teotihuacan, it's a frustrating, Pete, because
Yeah.
we it's such a big site. It's politically so important in the Maya story. But if you go to Teotihuacan, there's no writing we can read. There's no historical records that we can read there.
Almost no
And so
individuals.
yeah, and we don't even know what language they spoke, uh, despite their huge influence on everything. So this is something that we're struggling with right now. This is all pretty recent new stuff that we're trying to wrap our heads around. But they're powerful, they are influential, they come into the Maya world, they elbow their way through Maya politics for a while, and then they recede. And by the mid 400s or late 400s, not really there much anymore. Maybe at some other places they are, but their influence is waning, and Teotihuacan collapses. We know archaeologically around 600 AD. The Maya are going strong, and their kingdoms keep going for another 200 years.
Then they don't go anymore.
And then they don't. Maybe there's a connection there too, between these collapses and these end points, right?
Yes, we should just add on that, I mean, this isn't the end for the Maya, because we would then have this sort of terminal classic, then we have the post-classic, and
That's
then by
right.
the time Europeans arrive, they're still going. Maya are still living in urban centres, but
Of course,
it's not
yeah.
quite
And
the same scale, right? It's not quite the same scale as the classic.
that's right. There is this misconception out there that the Maya disappeared, after eight,
They're still
900
around now.
AD
There's
or
millions
1,000. Of
millions of
course, they're
Maya.
still around.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have I have Maya relatives in my extended family. I mean, they're still around, and the languages are still spoken. The idea that the Maya disappeared, that simply comes from this kind of misconception of encountering these large abandoned cities, like Tikal, like Calakmul, right? So in the 19th century, it wasn't even known who built these cities that explorers and locals were coming across. I think the Maya of the 1800s and early 1900s sometimes didn't also know that their ancestors built these places. There's a disconnect there that comes from the colonial period. But yeah, this idea that the Maya disappeared is just wrong. What they did is they left. They abandoned these cities for practical reasons. The elites moved on, and they were moving on all the time. This is another thing that really resonates with me as I look at written history, as I look at archaeology, is that they were very capable of establishing these, beautiful spaces and elite communities, uh, incorporating all stations of society sometimes, but very often they would decide to move. And this could happen on many different scales. And what I see the collapse of 850 or so being is a massive, almost collective decision to move on and do something different. Now there are external pressures. There's drought, climate change, there's war going on, but it is, I think, a Maya decision to realize this is not working. Uh, and there is, I'm sure, trauma and it's a crisis, an existential crisis for many. But people move. People go and they set up shop in new places, and they reformulate their civilization.
I'm gonna ask you something difficult. I mean, why did the classic Maya collapse happen?
The classic Maya collapsed because of an inherent instability in their elite society that was maybe the result of endemic warfare. It maybe was the result of the practicalities of living in a challenging landscape where water was not always easy to get. Maya civilization was also very young in the grand scheme of things. I just want to set the stage here by saying that we know from archaeology that permanent settlements and agriculture were not really firmly established in the Maya lowlands until maybe 1500 BC. And,
Okay,
in
yeah.
1,000 years after that, we have the beginnings of urbanism. I mean, think about that. kind of trajectory of development. And then you have the collapse of many of these pre-classic cities, and new ones appear for the classic period. There's these ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs throughout Maya history. Not just one collapse. There are innumerable collapses on a small scale and a few big collapses on a large scale. What I go back to is just this fact that Maya civilization grew at this exponential pace that may have, I don't know, may have baked into the system somehow a bit of instability, a little bit of precariousness. I don't know. I'm speaking in generalities here, but this is sort of how I see it. Right? Is that the Maya were used to these cadences of rises and falls, of impermanence on the landscape. That probably goes back, to these previous ways of living in the rainforests there, right? So by the 800, 900 AD, I think it was just, as before, it wasn't necessarily a radical idea to pick up and move. And it was a kind of a collective moment for a lot of people to do it at the same time.
Change certainly seems to be a constant in their lives, doesn't it? And
change is a constant in their lives, and I think they acknowledged this, and I think it was part of their metaphysical outlook on the world, right? And maybe it's something that we could someday embrace in ours. This idea that cities or communities or households have to always be there and be permanent. I think that's very foreign to the Maya and Mesoamerican mindset. And we see this archaeologically too, right?
Because they would, as you've mentioned as well, that with the Snake Kingdom, they would move around all the time. They would
the royal courts were moving around, exactly right.
Yeah.
So and not just because things were bad. I mean, they were moving around because they wanted to, maybe have closer proximity to these wars that were going on. The kings moving their courts around. So this is a great example. I think there's constant movement, there's constant flux and reshuffling, and the collapse should be seen in those terms. The collapse is maybe just a tipping point in an unstable system, or in a system that involves these movements and these kind of precarious connections. Right, a tipping point comes along. It's fragile to begin with, and that's it. And the Maya move on, out of their own agency, and they move on to do something different.
That's the thing. They were deciding to move. They weren't being forced necessarily. It was their own
one of the
decision.
things I really do mention in the book is that, we shouldn't see the collapses as some sort of, just as an external force, right? Of course there are external pressures, but it's their decision to do it, right? And so they didn't just disappear and go poof. They moved.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, Chichen Itza and Uxmal and these Mayapan, these other cities, they only go up after the classic collapse.
That's right. And they have their own stories, where Uxmal is a good example, where I think it has its own rise and fall. And its own rise and fall is, it rises kind of in, as these southern kingdoms are collapsing, and it has its own kind of crescendo, and then
it has maybe a great time when all of the kingdoms are collapsing.
Yeah, 150 years is probably 200 years is its heyday. That's it. And then Chichen Itza is another one of these rather short-lived local power centers and religious centers.
What's the future for Maya studies? Something that I always hear about, and I'm sure all the listeners to this hear about, is LIDAR. I mean, how much is LIDAR revolutionizing the field?
Oh, it's changing so much. I mean, LIDAR is a great tool for all archaeologists, of course, no matter where you're working in the world. But maybe I'm biased in this. Having worked at sites where I'm mapping in the jungle and I can't see a pyramid that's 10 meters in front of me because of the density of the vegetation, LIDAR in the Maya world has revolutionized our sense of what's on the ground. And I think many listeners will have seen, examples of some of these LIDAR captures over Tikal or over other areas. There are constantly new research articles coming out looking at population, changing our sense of how densely populated this place was. A new paper just came out identifying markets at many Maya sites, which we never really would have seen otherwise, right?
Mm.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
you know, we can see roadways, we can see uh, all sorts of things. There needs to be a lot of ground truthing of these features. So I have friends and colleagues who are very active in this stuff. It's changing everything. It may be an exaggeration, but I see it as almost like the invention of photography in the late 1800s,
Yeah.
in just
Yeah.
allowing us to
I would
see
agree.
things in a completely new way.
I would agree because I mean, up until up until LIDAR, you had to pick a bit, didn't you? You pick a bit to focus on. You can't do the whole thing. But
That's
now
right.
we can sort of see the whole thing.
And it would take 2 or 3 years to map a site adequately, and now you just see it on a
Oh,
LiDAR capture. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah,
as
I
a
remember
student.
I was reading about the Palenque, maps taking 10, 15 years to do,
Oh yeah, right.
and
I
now
know. I know. As
now
a
you can do
grad
it in a
student,
few
I was out
hours.
there hacking around with a machete trying
Oh,
to
you were
map a
doing it.
site. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, just terrible.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think that's something that my grad students have to do necessarily. Yeah, it's amazing. It's a great time to be in this field because of this technological stuff and the historical stuff, and it's a wonderful convergence right now of knowledge.
It's very exciting, particularly with the Maya. Yeah, it's everything seems to be coming together. What are you working on currently?
Oh, well, I'm working on some of my research projects. I've gone back to some of them. As I mentioned briefly, some of these projects go back a ways, dealing with research and interpretations that I was literally doing in the 80s and 90s. So I'm writing up translations and analyses of historical religious texts. I'm publishing some of the archaeological work that we've done at the site of San Bartolo with our colleagues there, preparing a book on that. I'd like to get back to writing a popular book as well. Maybe not so much looking at history, but looking at Maya religion and Maya
Oh,
philosophy, and
oh, very
kind of
nice, very nice.
depicting that in a way that really represents what we understand through their voices, right? Through their texts and their art.
That'd be great. Oh, that'd be really good. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can certainly see that being a big success. You've got a book out. Is it out now? Is it out soon?
Well, I have it out. It's out now in the U.S. The Four Heavens: A New History of the Ancient Maya, and it's coming out in the UK very shortly, I think. And it's
I'm
coming
very
out
much looking forward to reading
in
it.
Spanish. Yeah, it's kind of a Spanish edition's coming out too this year.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'll put links to everything in the description below to anyone who wants to get the book. And yeah, anything else? Anything you want to add?
No, just it's a lot of fun to be talking about this. I'm often so immersed in the details of my studies that to sit and talk, as the hour kind of progresses, I kind of realize, this is great stuff
Well, it is
that
great
I'm working
stuff.
on, right? I just want to reflect on that a
It
little
it
bit. Like it
oh,
is, I try
it
to
really
convey this
is.
to my
Yeah,
students as well. It's like this is a great time to be working on it.
it
Yeah,
really is. Yeah,
just
it
the
really is.
excitement, and it's a good problem to have. Too many things to be trying to publish and work on. Too many projects. So um,
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. You'll never run out of things to do.
never. That's for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, fantastic, David Stuart. Thanks for talking to us. That was a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed that.
Thanks,
Right.
Pete. I enjoyed it too.